watching West Hartford Community Television.
Welcome to Healthy Living. I'm your host, Roseanne Mascolo. The title of tonight's show is Good Grief. I'd like to introduce my guest, Ron Rising, who is the Assistant Manager at Wheeler Clinic's Employee Assistance Program in Plainville, Connecticut. Welcome, Ron. It's so nice to have you on the show again.
Good to be here again.
Thanks for coming. Ron, my first question to you actually has to do with the title of the show, and you actually recommended the title for this show. Can you briefly explain why the title, Good Grief?
Okay, well, I'm not thinking of Charlie Brown there, which may come to mind. Actually, I can't claim credit for the originality of the title. It comes from a little book that I've used for years and shared with people that's called Good Grief. It's written by a pastoral counselor from Chicago, Granger Westberg. And in that book, he talks about the pattern of grief, and he talks about good and bad grief, and he tries to help people to see grief as a natural process and suggests that there are even some good things that can come out of it. And so I like that concept, and it's in that vein that I use the title and that I'd like to kind of try to focus my comments and sharing with people this afternoon to see, to have them see grief as something that can be positive, and to also encourage people to allow themselves to go through the grief process as a natural, healthy, important process that can even have some good results from it.
All right. Ron, why and how did you get involved in grief, the subject of grief, and working with people who are having difficulty dealing with their grief?
Right. It sounds kind of morbid probably to say, why do you want to work in the area of grief? Actually, I find it to be one of the most important and satisfying areas that I work in now. And I come at it not intentionally saying I want to focus on working with people around grief, but you know I wear a couple of different hats, and one of them is as an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ, and I still work in a small parish part-time. And in that capacity and in my ministry over the years, that one of the duties or responsibilities I've had is to work with people around the deaths of loved ones, to do funerals, to do grief counseling. And so I've had more exposure than the average person probably to working with people in that area, and I've found it important. And then in my counseling work as an employee assistance counselor, where I work in the workplace counseling employees around various issues, I've found, particularly in recent years, that a lot of the issues I deal with people around are also grief-related issues. Maybe not physical death itself, maybe some other losses, but I find myself doing a lot of grief work in that capacity too, which is not unlike or dissimilar to the grief work I do in my formal ministry. So in both areas, I've found that that's a really important area to help people in, that we don't generally get a lot of help or direction in our lives.
Ron, why is dealing with grief such a problem in our culture today? What's your opinion on that?
Well, I think it is. I think, as one person has suggested, there's kind of a little silent conspiracy, you know, about dealing with grief openly in public. I mean, it used to be easier where men would wear black armbands. I think they said FDR was one of the last people to wear one of those.
Oh, really?
In mourning, and women would wear black veils, and you knew they were in grief, and there's something symbolic about that, or you can respect and recognize that this person must have lost somebody recently. We don't do that now, and
And I think it wasn't unusual, Ron, that people in that time period and before might have worn that armband, the black armband, or women might have worn black up to a year.
Right. Yeah, for quite a while. And we don't do that now, as Westberg in his book, I think, points out. We offer our sympathy and condolences to somebody at the time of the loss, maybe go to the wake, go to the funeral, and then it's implied that, well, okay, we've done that, let's get back to life as usual, business as usual, and want to skip over it. And I think people are uncomfortable with the idea of death, and we're talking a little bit about some of the kinds of things where people mean well with some of the platitudes and things they say, and I think in fact it just reflects their own discomfort with thinking about death, because after all it's a pretty final kind of thing.
And something we all have to go through.
Right, yeah. And who was it? Will Rogers, who said, you know, two things are inevitable or you can't avoid. One is taxes and the other is death. And we don't like to admit, I think, see, coming to dealing with death, dealing with grief, I think is very much a spiritual kind of issue. Obviously a life and death issue, but you don't get much more life and death than when you're talking about death, obviously. And I think to come to terms with death means accepting our finitude, our limitations, the fact that we're not going to live forever, we're not going to be able to do everything we want to do.
We're not invincible.
We're not invincible, right? I know even though as a teenager we thought we were,
right.
As you get older, and as my body reminds me, you know, I'm not anymore. And so we don't like to admit that there's a kind of denial. Maybe if I ignore it, it'll go away. Or sweep it under the rug over here and we won't talk about it, and it won't happen to me.
Although, Ron, isn't some of that denial okay? Because if people were to go around and think about death all the time in terms of their own mortality,
right,
people would have a lot of difficulty
Oh, agreed. Yeah,
with
I'm not
that.
saying they should focus. That would be morbid and unhealthy. On the other hand, but I think that's why I say I think it's a spiritual issue. I don't think you can really, or it's hard for people to deal with death without some faith framework or spiritual framework within which to put it. You know, but if studies have shown that people who have a religious faith, some spiritual orientation, that helps them to give meaning to their life and to death, and that explains their relationship to the world and to other things around them. If you believe in an afterlife and so forth, it's a lot easier to accept death than it is if you don't have that kind of a framework.
Yes, I fully agree with you.
So for me, it's kind of a catch-22 or a chicken and an egg, that I think to deal with death, you have to have some philosophy or theology of life that encompasses death, and also it's only until, or not until, we really come to terms with death and accept that then we're free to live fully. So I think both are true. There's an interesting book quite a few years back now, Denial of Death. Becker, I think, wrote it. And in that, his premise was that a lot of people go through life trying to avoid, trying to beat this whole concept of death, of their finitude, you know, that if I run fast enough, if I work hard enough, if I accomplish enough, this won't happen to me, I'm going to beat it. And that, you know, that's a kind of denial that I think isn't healthy, because it's a futile kind of thing. And yet I think, on the other hand, coming to terms with the reality of death as a part of life can help you appreciate and live life a lot more fully.
How true.
I don't know if that makes sense.
Oh,
but,
it does.
I think this was brought out for me, if I can share a personal note for a minute,
Sure.
that probably is also one of the explanations why I'm a little bit more interested in and eager to help other people deal with grief kinds of issues. That some 6 years ago or so, I had some heart problems and was rushed to the hospital, 911, with a serious blockage that ended up in angioplasty. And after you lay on the table there going in 911 and you're not sure if you're going to make it, it really changes your perspective on things and what's important in life. And I'm reminded constantly, even by, where is it, my little nitro capsule here that I have to carry with me every day with my nitro tablets, that hopefully I don't have to use, but if I need a reminder of my finitude, of my limitations, of my vulnerability, then I have it. But I think that's been good in a way, because it's helped me appreciate life, which I see as a gift. There are no guarantees. Things can happen and change quickly in our lives, and we think that happens to everybody else in the newspaper or the news or something. it can happen to us too. You know, I'm a little more aware than other people that I could die of a heart attack this afternoon. Hopefully I won't. But, you know, there's that kind of vulnerability. But I think that's also kind of pushed me and helped me to wrestle some with the issue of life and death and my place in the world and how I deal with death in the context of my faith. And I think that helps me appreciate life more fully since that happened. And I think it makes me more sensitive and compassionate to other people who are going through similar kinds of issues.
I can see where that would be true.
So it's kind of a long answer to your question, but it's all related.
Yes, okay. Ron, I think when most people think of the word grief, they pretty much automatically associate it with death. But there are other types of grief. Could you go over the different types of grief?
There are, because we know now that in the same way that people have grief when somebody dies and they lose a loved one, that there's also grief involved with other losses. Let's say I have a list here someplace. One of the things I grieve for myself is the loss of my memory. It's not what it used to be, you know. I need a little computer upgrade here as I get older, so...
Maybe making more notes for yourself, right?
That's it, yes, okay, let's see. Okay, some of the other kinds of issues that people, or losses that people feel, they might be health-related issues. I suggested, or shared, you know, personally for myself, when you have something like some heart trouble, maybe I think for women to have breast surgery, you know, or hysterectomy, other kinds of things where you lose a part of your body and a part of your identity, as it were, at times.
Sure.
That people have to wrestle with that. I mentioned getting older, not being able to do the same things, not having the memory you used to have, not being able to play the games and be as physically active as the kids you see out on the street, because you're not old enough to experience that yet, but I do. So there's those kinds of issues. There are relationship issues, losses and divorce and friendship breakup, or even somebody moving out of town. Gee, I lost my best friend. What am I going to do? I used to talk to her on the phone every day, and now she lives in California.
Yeah, that can be
that can be a real loss.
Sure.
You know, you're happy for them at the same time. It was a good move, a good job, but that's a loss. Co-workers that have moved on. In counseling, we see some serious abandonment issues. You probably do too in your work, particularly people that come from what we call dysfunctional families, where there were issues of abandonment of a mom or dad not being there physically or emotionally, and people grieve that loss for a long time, as you know, and in many instances, without working through that, continue looking for somebody else to fill that void, and nobody does. So those are the loss of attention, affection, a parent, a role model. Job-related issues, the loss of a job, the loss of the way it was, you know, the rules, the paradigms have changed, so, you know, loyalty doesn't count anymore. Gee, when you used to work for this company, it meant something that, you know, you hear this all the time, and now it doesn't, I'm just a number, you know, that kind of issue. And again, related to all those kinds of losses, there's a loss of pride, of self-confidence, sometimes of meaning in life that can go along with some of these other losses. And the grief we know now, and I see in my work, the grief that people feel around those losses are just as real and very similar to the grief that people feel at an actual physical death.
Okay.
So the deaths of different kinds.
Ron, is it possible that people can be grieving and they're not even aware of it?
Yes, I had a good example of that recently. In fact, there was a woman that came into the office at one of the work sites I'm at, and it was an initial assessment. She shared a good bit of her history and some various things that she had to deal with and was wrestling with, one of which was a marriage that she was still in, but that had obviously died some years back, and she needed to make some decisions about that. There was also the last child that just left home for school. And so she shared for a while, and then after she finished giving me some of the history, I said, gee, it sounds like you've had a lot of significant losses in your life. I think you're experiencing some grief, because some of the other things she'd been telling me indicated to me that she really had a lot of the classic signs of grief. And she had never looked at it that way before. It was kind of, she, you know, stopped to think about it. But as she stopped to think about it, it made sense. It fit. And so I talked with her some about needing to do some of that kind of grief work. And particularly if you haven't done grief work earlier on certain things and then you experience other losses, it all piles up. And then there's even more grief work to do, or it triggers some of the old feelings. And people may not be aware. In some instances, they wonder what's the matter with me, you know, and there's nothing really the matter with them except that they're feeling some loss that they haven't worked through.
Ron, are there some right ways and wrong ways of grieving, how people grieve?
Well, there are. The one thing I want to say is there's no one set way that's the right way that works for everybody. I think one thing I'd like people to get from our sharing is that grief is really a process that you need to allow yourself to go through that has different steps and stages, some of which we can identify, but it needs to be an individual thing, that how you grieve and respond to a certain loss will be different from how I might grieve and how somebody else might grieve. And we can't, or it's unfair to judge other people or expect them to deal with the loss in the same way that we do. You know, people say, oh, I don't know what they're getting so upset about. It's no big deal. But to the other person, for other reasons, it may be a big deal. So I think we need to respect that. So I think there are some right and wrong kinds of things. I think, you know, some of the things that I see quoted as the wrong way is to try to deny it, to repress it, to not allow yourself to feel the feelings, to try to stuff it, or take a shortcut. That doesn't work because it's going to rear its ugly head someplace else and can have you know, repercussions on people. So one of the things I hope in our focusing on some different things now, I hope we can help people to do is be aware of some healthy, positive, quote, right ways to deal with grief.
Okay. Ron, are there actually stages that people go through during the grief process?
There are, and some people are hesitant, some of the experts in the field are hesitant to delineate stages because, again, each person's different and each situation is different, but nurse out of England, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, years ago,
very well
everybody
known.
knows that name, yeah, very well known as one of the landmarks in terms of talking about some stages, and some of her initial stages were the first kind of shock and disbelief that you have, the feeling of unreality. Oh, this can't be happening to me, the wanting to deny it, to maybe some anger. You know, darn it, why did this person have to die? Or why am I losing this job? I liked it, you know, to...
And sometimes they can actually get angry at the deceased person.
Oh, yeah,
And,
right.
But that's okay.
Right. Yes.
All right.
Oh, yeah. And sometimes angry at God, too. And we'll talk about that later, but I tell people it's okay to be angry at God. He or she can take it. But anyway, that's another point we'll get to.
Okay.
So there are some stages, and from the initial shock and disbelief to maybe some of the anger related to that can be some depression, particularly if the anger is not dealt with and stuffed.
Right.
And when people turn the anger inwards, that can lead to depression. Some bargaining, you know. Well, how about instead of my not working at all, I work half-time? See, I'll make a deal with you. You don't need to cut me altogether. We can work out a compromise here.
Right.
But that doesn't always work, and in the case of death, not as easy to work out those compromises.
No, certainly not.
No.
Ron, what happens to people who deny themselves going through the grief process? They just kind of ignore that and push it to the side. What can happen to those people who do that?
Well, there are serious repercussions of that. They can get stuck. You know, we didn't finish going through the process there, but from the shock and denial and the disbelief and the anger and the depression, hopefully if it's worked through with some things we'll talk about, they come around to kind of looking at things in a different way, reorganizing themselves, finding some new hope, some new meaning. And what happens with somebody who doesn't allow themselves to go through the process is they can get really stuck, particularly in the anger, maybe, you know, somebody who's just full of bitterness and you wonder why, or the depression, or they can become physically sick. We know people can become sick physically and or mentally from not dealing with the feelings, from harboring the bitterness, the anger, the resentment. Can really affect our bodies physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. You know, I've seen that with people. And also I think they gyp them. They gyp two people. They gyp themselves and they gyp other people from being able to experience life fully. They gyp or rob their family and friends from being able to support them when they isolate themselves.
Right.
You know, and I think they kind of gyp themselves of the opportunity of moving ahead and enjoying life more freely.
Okay. Ron, can positive things that happen to us in our lives cause us to grieve?
Yeah, they can. I mentioned earlier, say a move. You know, you might make a move, or a friend of yours might make a move that is good in some respects in terms of advancement professionally, nice new house, a bigger salary, and so forth. But it may be very hard on that family, and we see this sometimes in working with kids. Very hard on the kids if they've got a real close set of friends and they were established in school and now they have to be uprooted and go someplace else, and they miss their friends and those relationships and they don't have something to substitute for it, and people can experience serious grief even out of something like that in some respects is positive,
right,
but still means, you know, some losses. So things are a trade-off, and somebody said everything in life is a trade-off, and you get something positive over here, but there may be some losses over here.
Okay.
And let's see, you just triggered another thought for me, and to go back to your early question of why grief is so hard to deal with in our society. One of the things I find, and particularly in the workplace these days, is everything's so fast-paced. You know, you got to do this, you got to do this, you got to do this. There are deadlines, and then you just get one system down, and then they change it and reorganize it. Now you got to do it another way. And one of the things I find in the workplace, particularly when I go in, for instance, to work with a group to help them do some grief around the immediate crisis or change, is that I find out there's 6 changes before that they have never had a chance to grieve, and so those come up too. And things are moving so fast that people don't have time to adjust to the changes and the losses that were a part of the change that happened earlier, and now they're being asked to make another one, and they're just piling up.
Right. Okay. Ron, what are some of the common reactions that people have to death and loss?
Well, there are a variety of things. We've touched on some. Let me refer to my list again to help my failing memory here. The question is, if you lost your mind, would you miss it? Right? So, different reactions that people have to death and loss. Some we've mentioned: the shock, the numbness, feelings of unreality, this can't be happening to me, crying uncontrollably. And people will come and say, I don't know why, but I just, you know, I sit at my desk and I just cry and I feel so vulnerable and I don't know why. And then we explore that many times. There's some grief issues there. Things like eating disorders, loss of appetite, overeating, other addictions or abuse of substances or food. Short physical signs like shortness of breath, tightness of the throat or chest, pain in the chest, sexual difficulties, lower self-image, lack of energy and motivation, or on the other hand, hyperactivity, trouble concentrating, slowed thinking, and people are more accident prone when they're like this. So I caution people who have just experienced a major loss to be careful, because in a way I think of it as a wound. It's a kind of wound or a shock. It's like you've been hit on a football field and, you know, they've knocked you on your back and you're out of breath and you feel vulnerable, and also you're not concentrating or focusing, so you're more vulnerable when you're driving, you're more accident prone, so to be more careful and kind of pamper yourself, treat yourself gently. So those are some of the kinds of reactions that people may have.
What about some of the feelings that are associated with grief? Could you go over that?
Yeah, there are a variety of feelings, and people may feel several of these at once. You can feel, for instance, happy and sad at the same time, like we talked about the move that can be positive on the one hand and negative on the other. Some of the feelings people feel are particularly helplessness or hopelessness, especially initially, especially as people are feeling very lonely, feeling very much in pain, maybe having a sense of there's nothing to live for, how can I go on, why bother? Guilt, real or imagined, you know, justifiable or otherwise. If only I'd done this, if only I'd said this, maybe I could have prevented. I should have been there, I should have seen it coming, you know, all those shoulda, wouldas, couldas. In which case, when I start hearing those from people, I tell them to go easy, that they need to forgive themselves, that they need to give themselves a break, that they need to kind of treat themselves as they would a friend going through this.
Okay.
We mentioned the anger, guilt, and maybe fear, the uncertainty. How am I going to make it? How am I going to go on? Tell me, what am I going to do? I've lost this key person in my life, or I've lost my job or my identity. How can I continue? So all those kinds of feelings, and maybe together with them kind of feeling overwhelmed.
And Ron, could you address what families and friends and family members who know someone who lost someone, what they can do and maybe not do to help this person with their grief?
Okay, you were supposed to phrase that question. How do family members deal with other people who are having grief? And I was going to say, usually not well.
Oh,
but that's okay. But that's okay. So that's the point I want to make, is that many times people mean well, again, but the kinds of things they say or do not really help. And I think one thing that's important is not to offer platitudes. You know, and people wonder or worry the main question I get when I work with a group, like if, say, there's been a death of a coworker, and people wonder, well, what am I, or there's been a death of a coworker's family member maybe, and well, when she comes back to work, what am I going to say to her? And what I say to people is, you don't have to worry about saying very much. The main thing is to be there with them, your presence. You know, sometimes just a touch, you know, a pat, a nod, hey, you know, I've been thinking of you, feeling for you. You don't have to say a whole lot, and particularly you don't have to fix it, and you don't have to take away the pain. That's particularly for us guys, because we're fixers, you know.
Right.
So particularly hard for us. But you don't, in fact, you can't take away the pain, number one, and if you could, that wouldn't be a good thing, because the person needs to feel the pain for a while.
Okay.
And so you don't need to take away the pain. If anything, share the pain with them. If they're crying, cry with them if you can. That's okay. Just let them know that you're there. Let them offer to do something positive or useful if you can. Don't take everything away from them. It's important for them to be able to do some things for themselves. But the main thing is to be there, listen, don't judge. Don't say, oh, you'll get over it, or oh, it isn't that bad. Maybe it is that bad to them. You know, if they've just broken up with somebody, don't say, oh, you know, there are plenty of fish in the sea.
That's the last thing that people want to hear.
People hate that. You know, I hate it when I hear that. You know, I've had that said to me, and that doesn't help. There may be, but that's not what I'm thinking right now, because I miss this particular fish, you know, so.
Okay. Ron, can you list some resources that people can turn to help them deal with their grief?
Well, there are a number of resources out there in the community, and I'm glad you asked that, because one of the things I really want to encourage people to do is to access resources. And one of the things I meant to say earlier in the program is that our talking about this may trigger some things for people out there who realize that they've got some grief they haven't dealt with, or some of the things we've said have helped them to get in touch with some grief that's maybe unresolved, that I hope people will deal with that. And there are resources in the community. Let's see, and I made a list of them also here, if we can find them on my sheet. Okay, so first off, certainly to use family and friends. And one of the key, this is a good question because it relates to one of the key things points I want to make about dealing with grief, is don't isolate yourself and try to tough it out alone. Use support, family, friends, clergy, maybe you have an employee assistance program at work, medical professionals, doctors, nurses, social service agencies, counselors or therapists, support groups. If people aren't sure where to find one, call InfoLine or AARP. There's Parents Without Partners for people who've lost partners. There's hospice programs that can give resources for dealing with grief.
And I believe, Ron, we are going to be running some of these organizations that you did mention when the credits roll.
There'll be a list of those, and there'll
the
also be a credit including number to get a hold of me if people aren't quite sure where to get some resources.
Wonderful.
I'd be glad to point them in the right direction.
Well, unfortunately, we do have to start wrapping up. But before we do, I see you brought in this beautiful photograph, and I'd like you to just briefly explain how this relates to our show, Dealing with Grief.
Oh, thanks. Well, one of my passions on the side probably definitely is photography, as you know. And I thought I'd bring in one of my pictures, and this one that I brought, seascapes are a favorite of mine, and some people have described the grief process as kind of like a wave that, you know, the waves can pound in, and at times they can knock you over, seem pretty fierce, and at other times they can be soothing and cleansing. And so this picture to me represents a kind of peace and a serenity, which is maybe a goal to strive towards in life and in death. And people may not feel that, certainly. I don't expect people to feel that in the middle of grief. You know, we talk about positive things that can come out of grief, and they can be a learning experience. But I think it's a reminder that even though right now it may seem very cloudy and gloomy in our life, the sun doesn't shine, and the future looks pretty bleak, the sun is there. The sun will come out again. The wind is blowing. The water can be calming and soothing.
Okay.
There is life that goes on as the repetition of the waves.
Well, I think that's a wonderful note to end this show on, and I want to thank you, Ron, for joining us on Healthy Living and giving so much great information on the subject of grief.
You're welcome. Glad to do it.
And good night from Healthy Living.